Yes, it's another 50 Churches Act church, and this one's from the posh part of town. In the 1700s, London was expanding both east and west. London's expansion was the primary reason for building the 50 Churches Act churches, all 12 of them. And in the west, at least, there were some pretty well-off places, and it was well-off back then, and it's well-off today. It's this one. On the day I visited this church when I took this picture, the front of the church was covered up. And when I came back again, when we cycled the 50 Churches Act churches, link in the description, the front was all clear again, but it was an incredibly grey day. Am I going to get lucky today? Oh, no, it's a special effect.
My name's Matthew and I'm the Verger at St George's.
One of the very first churches I looked at was St Paul's in Deptford, and so that's one of the 50 Churches Act churches.
Yeah.
That's how I heard about St George's.
Yes, there's a whole group of these churches in London. I believe the Act of Parliament was in 1714 in the reign of Queen Anne. They're often called Queen Anne churches for this reason. To cater for the expanding population, there was a plan to build 50 churches quite ambitiously with a tax on coals. They got round, I think, to about 14 of them, certainly nowhere near 50.
Yeah.
And St George's is one of those churches, as you say. St Paul's Deptford was another.
There was lots of hijinks about this particular spot.
Yes, I think they'd laid all the materials out in Hanover Square, which had just been laid out and commissioned not that long before, kind of at the start of the Hanoverian ascendancy, hence all of the names around here. And the residents of this very new, very fashionable neighbourhood were not very happy to see it turned into a building site. And there was some controversy there. Slightly evident actually in the site of St George's. In a dissimilar manner to some of the other local churches, think St Peter Eaton Square, which is very well presented right on the edge of quite a long promenade, essentially, Eaton Square itself. St George's is very much kind of off to the side. Part of it is that it wasn't the original intention for this to be the parish church. There's actually an older church just down the road, which is now under one of the buildings on Conduit Street. That was the original church here. Not there anymore, no. Parish churches have to be built on freehold land, and nobody really noticed at the time that Mayfair was being laid out that there was a lease on the land that chapel was built on. So that made a quite pressing need to find a site for a permanent parish church, which is where St George's has its origins. And the land was donated then by General Stuart. My favourite General Stuart story is that he was duelling with a colonel, and even though he was just 2 yards away, managed to miss and blow the colonel's hat off. This AI seems to think they're a bit American looking. What about this one? I said shot AI. Oh, AI is both miraculous and rubbish. On this kind of slightly awkward corner just off of Hanover Square, not really on the main thoroughfare either. Grosvenor Street was being laid out at this point, but we're not at the end of that road, we're rather to the side of it where it turns into Maddox Street. So there's this slightly controversial, slightly rushed history behind why St George's is exactly where it is. And part of the brief really for John James, who was the architect, was to make the most of it. And I think that's why you've got the very distinctive, quite large, bold portico, which the pavement there forms actually the public right-of-way. There isn't a kind of municipal pavement in front of it. The church itself is part of the street furniture, and I think that's John James using every inch of available space to make his impression on the landscape. I think I read that there was going to be a statue of King George there? Yeah, correct. The original intention was when you look at the front of the portico, the apex of what we might call a gable, there's a very Italianate, floral, kind of cartouche almost on the front, and originally that was to be surmounted by a statue of King George. Oh, so it was going to go on top? Yeah, very much the reasoning behind the dedication to St George was because of George being on the throne quite early in the rule. Oh, that was going to be my next question. Oh, yeah. Okay. And then Hanover Square is named after. A lot of the 50 churches, Act churches, are dedicated to St George. I mean, some are historic, so like the ones that were repaired, like Southwark, was already called St George. Yes, it was already St George the Martyr. But the St George in Bloomsbury, I mean, there's St George's everywhere. Yes, yeah. Which sometimes causes problems today when people go to the wrong St George's. But you have to remember as well the politics of the day. There was a real need to underline and support the succession of the House of Hanover to the throne. This had happened within very recent memory for most people. So part of the kind of municipal expansion of London is this new royal house putting its stamp on the occasion. That's why we've got Hanover Square. It's why we've got all these dedications to St George. It's why there was plans to put a statue of St George on top of St George's Church, for example. We often get mistaken for a Wren church, or
Yes.
people ask, did Christopher Wren design this? And we're a generation too late, at least, if not two. But I can certainly see the resemblance, very much of its time. Some people refer to these buildings as preaching boxes when the focus of the service was the sermon. The pulpit actually is original to 1724. It would have been originally a lot taller and had a canopy, but the body of the pulpit itself is original.
Oh, okay.
And that gives you an idea of the importance that was placed on that. And really the layout then reflects it. So the ground floor would have had box pews similarly to up here, and the focus then would have been on this very tall wooden, almost double-decker reading desk that used to be where the lectern is today, and then also the very tall pulpit, which originally was level with the galleries. So today, if you sit in the gallery, you don't really see much of the action on the ground floor, but when the church was originally built and furnished, the preacher was elevated to a level that meant that he could see everybody in the building and vice versa.
Do you have a professional choir?
We do, yeah.
That must be a draw.
Absolutely, yes,
Yeah.
certainly. And the musical tradition of St George's is very well known as well. We were Handel's parish church when he lived in Brook Street. We're also therefore the home of the London Handel Festival.
What does that entail?
So the festival runs in the spring, usually March to April. It was set up by Dennis Darlow in the 70s when he was the director of music and the organist here at St George's, and it's since grown to be a very high-profile annual event with the International Handel Singing Competition that many people have, I wouldn't say necessarily had their start at, but very early career development. It's very much focused on young singers.
If you sing sacred music, you're very likely to start with some Handel.
If you sing sacred music in London, there's a good chance you've passed through these doors at some point, even in a short
Well, I haven't,
capacity.
and I sing a lot. So and I don't think I've ever been to a concert here either. Which
You're missing out.
Which
You
I'm
certainly
surprising.
should.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a very active programme of concerts. That's a nice side effect of the architects having been so concerned about the acoustics for speech, means that we're also quite a good
Of course.
space to perform and sing in, especially to sing.
Yeah. Would Handel have performed oratorios here?
We are fairly certain that Messiah, for example, was never performed at St George's in Handel's lifetime. It's difficult to say. We know that he was involved in the recruitment of the first director of music, which was a gentleman called Thomas Rosengrave, who was an Anglo-Irish composer, actually from a family of musicians. Handel supplied, part of that process was to improvise on a theme that was supplied by the panel. The theme was supplied by Handel himself, and he sat on the panel and advised on the organ, although we know that he didn't have a specific formal role musically or liturgically in the church by that point.
And I guess it's Handel.
You've got to imagine, haven't you?
Yeah.
But yeah, he certainly consulted in the very early days, commissioning the instrument, appointing the first organist, for example.
So will have played.
Almost certainly, yes. Yeah, we don't have any record of it, but I would be shocked if he hadn't.
It's his local church. He was involved in the commissioning.
Absolutely,
instrument.
yeah. We're fairly certain that there wouldn't have been much in the way of musical performance. That was very much a world for what we might call a secular venue these days. And you have to remember that attitudes to performing music has changed over time. The Hanover Square rooms up on Hanover Square, as you might expect, were one of London's foremost concert spaces for about 100 years, which was largely set up by Johann Christoph Bach, sometimes called the London Bach, son of the very famous German composer J.S. Bach. So it gives you an idea of the musical heritage of the parish as well, as you've got all of this going on in the background.
This is what I can't quite work out. It's something like Handel's Messiah. Would that count as secular music?
Well, this is why these oratorios exist, because it was very frowned upon to perform things like opera in spaces such as this. So the oratorio is a way of getting around that prohibition. Almost semi-staged opera, although I'm sure that some musicologists might argue with that characterization. But it was a way of composing music and performing on the topic of biblical themes in a way that was not as controversial as, say, staging that in an opera house might have been because of the reputation of some of these places. Although that didn't stop Handel from composing opera on religious themes either.
Do any Handel pieces actually form part of the liturgy?
Occasionally, yes. So we sing sometimes movements from Messiah, especially at Christmas.
So, there's two things. There's two things that we really need to look at here. One is the Last Supper, and then the window above it.
Yes, they're an interesting contrast because the painting of the Last Supper was by an English artist called William Kent, and that was actually commissioned for the space. So if you're looking at the reredos, the area behind the altar, that's actually all pretty original. So all the wood carvings are original, probably from the workshop of Grinling Gibbons. And
they
very
are
famous.
Gibbons?
They're not Gibbons himself, they're too late for that, but they are quite characteristic of that style. So if you read the Pevsner article on St George's and various other architects, they often will say in the style of probably from the workshop of Grinling Gibbons, even if it's not going to have been Gibbons himself.
Yeah, but those guys are very, very reluctant to actually attribute.
It is simply too late to be Gibbons. He was unfortunately he was long dead by the time that these were commissioned. But you can see, compare them to St James Piccadilly down the road, which is definitely Gibbons. You can see the similarities. They're maybe not quite as flamboyant as Gibbons' own work, but they're certainly rather fine depictions of sheaves of wheat and grapes, as you would expect around the altar. And then framing the canvas, oil-on-canvas painting of the Last Supper, which was commissioned for the space. That's in contrast to the glass, which was very much not commissioned for the space. That dates to 1525. It's very late medieval, largely.
It's older than the window that it's in.
It's significantly older than the church, yes. Predates St George's by a couple of hundred years.
Did they make the windows that shape to fit the glass?
So this originally would have been clear glass. So the windows themselves are in the original shape, I should say, but it would have been clear glazing originally. These windows were then acquired by St George's in the 1840s after they'd been removed from a monastery in the Low Countries, I think in what is now Belgium. In the course of the Napoleonic Wars, they were then sold to the Marquis of Ely for his private chapel, but they never got around to installing them. And then St George's purchased them in the 1840s.
Was it actually the window? Is it actually a spoil of war?
It's difficult to say. So I think that depends on your perspective as well, because the monasteries were dissolved in the Low Countries by Napoleon, or at least by the upheaval of the Napoleonic Wars, and a lot of their contents were then sold off on the cheap, frankly. So in that sense, yes, the Marquis of Ely was probably taking advantage of it being quite affordable, shall we say. But whether or not it was kind of taken and carted out, it's difficult. So, for example, say the looting that happened in Egypt in the course of the Napoleonic Wars, where things like the Rosetta Stone were literally taken and run off with. That's not quite what happened here, although I think certainly it's a direct consequence of that conflict. So you could certainly make the argument that it is a spoil in that sense. And they were quite severely and drastically chopped up. Originally, they were part of three very tall, thin lancet windows, we call them, depicting a Jesse tree, which a lot of people may have heard of, quite a common subject for medieval glass, and it depicts the descent of the house of David. Of course, Jesus is adopted into David's line through his adopted earthly father, Joseph of Nazareth. And you can still just about make out some of the key features of this. So if you're looking right at the bottom in the middle, beneath the red roundel, which is a later addition, which I'll talk about in a moment, you can see the figure of Jesse asleep, who is the father of King David. So that sleeping figure is Jesse. That's quite a traditional depiction. And it also reflects the wording of some of the liturgies in Advent when we talk about the root of Jesse, O radix Jesse, towards the end of Advent as one of the Advent O antiphons. So that's why you get these in a lot of churches. And then originally it would have depicted essentially a family tree through to Joseph. And you can still see some of the figures named and obvious by their iconography. So you've got this very finely dressed chap in a blue robe here on the right. It's King Solomon. On the left, you can see King David and his harp, for example. But the chronology of it has been entirely broken up to fit into the different shape of the windows here. And some of it has been installed in another church. And originally, if you look very carefully, you can actually see some angels, which originally would have framed a depiction of God the Father in a very papal-looking outfit with a three-tiered papal crown. It was installed by Thomas Willimant, very famous glazier, in the 1840s, I think in 1841, and he is responsible then for the red roundels that you see. So there's a figure of St. George, for example, in this window here, and then the apostles are depicted in the windows in the galleries. So you've got this quite contrast, actually. You've got something that's very doctored and cut down literally to size versus the Last Supper, which was very much designed and commissioned with the space in mind.
But on the Last Supper, as I'm looking at it, I'm counting the people, and there's the right number of people. There's 12 people sitting around the table. I'm guessing
Judas sneaking
escaping.
off. Absolutely, yes.
But there's a woman at that table.
Well, it's a very feminine-looking St. John. So in
you
traditional,
don't think it's John next to him. He looks young.
In traditional depictions, the apostles are often depicted as quite elderly men. There's a figure facing away from us with a rather long hairdo, although I'm no expert on either 18th century fashions in hair, which is probably the thing you need to be an expert on to discuss this, or first century Judean fashion. But the figure next to Jesus, looking at, sometimes people will say, oh, that looks very feminine as well. It's probably St. John, who is often depicted as being significantly younger than the rest of the disciples.
Yes.
Even if that itself is an anachronism, there's almost no chance that all of the disciples would have been as old as they're often depicted.
Yes, you're right. None of them would have been old, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, the reasoning behind the depiction of that figure who's facing away from the congregation looking towards Christ, I couldn't tell you what was the motivation for that. There's certainly an ambiguity there, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I can't have been the first person to have noticed.
No.
You know, and one needs to be sensitive to gender politics and all the rest of it. But that's a feminine arm. There's every element of it is feminine. I don't know whether that reflects a political point of view that existed at the time. It seems implausible that early.
For all I know, it could well. Unfortunately, that's not my area of expertise, I'm afraid. I have to leave that to experts in 18th century English portraiture and art to discuss.
And then you've got these quite distinctive, I guess they're candles that's sitting in there?
Yes, they are. There should be 7 of them, unfortunately. One of them is currently away for repair. But they reflect... I like to think both a reflection of the depiction of the Last Supper, where we have a hanging oil lamp as well, so it's a nice nod to that, but also explicitly reflecting the 7 lamps described in the book of Revelation, representing the 7 churches.
As I'm looking around, I think so. I've just been to St Magnus, a martyr, this is quite a contrast.
Yeah, very different, very different.
Oh, they're only the lifetime of Renapart, so yeah. But also, other churches of a similar age constructed after the fire, you see many more monuments typically to people around the edge, and there's almost nothing. Almost
nothing at St George's, and that's a little bit of a mystery actually. Like you say, really, really common to be full of monuments for churches of this time. Part of it could be is that there were never any burials at St George's, another consequence of the site being so small and limited. There was originally a parish burial ground near Mount Street. That filled up very, very quickly. That was closed within about 40 years of it opening.
Regulars to the channel will know this because they built Farm Street on it. Link in the description.
And then there was a burial ground then north of Hyde Park, quite some way ultimately from the church. So that probably is the reason behind there not being very many memorials here. I think if you're, and this is me speculating now, but I would imagine if there was a crypt or even a closer burial ground that was more closely associated with the church and with the parish, you'd probably see more monuments.
But you've had plenty of famous people associated with the church.
Yeah, absolutely.
And married them as well.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, lots of society weddings reflecting, again, the demographic of the population that lived here. But also all through that period, the marriages of very ordinary people as well. If you live in the parish, anybody that lives in a church or in a parish has the right to be married in that parish church. And the same was true of domestic servants. So there's you get a lot of people coming to research their family history, and sometimes they had quite well-known ancestors, and sometimes it was, the scullery maids.
But the people attending then, the parishioners, won't have just been the great and the good, it will have been a mix.
Likely a mixture of both. Families would have attended together, and their servants would have attended at the same time often, probably not sat together, but at a similar time. We're now in the Lady Chapel, which is really with the baptistry at the other end of church, which is rather less decorated than this, actually kind of forms the last phase of major change and development at St George's. So these were installed in the 20s by Bloomfield. I say this chapel, and also the space near the vestry with these black columns forming the screen from the rest of church. And then the window was installed, as we see in the plaque next to it, in memory of is George Hatfield, and his youngest son as well, who was killed during the First World War in action. Oh. So it was donated in their memory. And it depicts Jerusalem, the heavenly city.
It's Jerusalem.
Yes.
Of course.
Along with a lot of, some of it quite obscure iconography, but a lot of them are titles for the Virgin Mary, for example, like Rosa Mystica. Yeah, top right. The bottom left is the depiction of lilies is often associated with St Joseph. We've got things like the fountain of life that you talk about, or you hear rather about in Revelation. And then the Marian Ave Maria symbol in the centre of the blue roundel there. It's a good example actually of changing tastes that we were talking about earlier. It would have been unthinkable in the 18th century to have this kind of Marian iconography, but by the 1920s that was quite acceptable in a Church of England church. The interesting bit with the glass here is that I said earlier we took a glancing blow from a German bomb towards the end of the Second World War to a V2. We took more damage from the suffragettes than we did from enemy action in the Second World War.
Why would those suffragettes have targeted here?
Partly because of its high-profile nature. You know, it's the church of a lot of politicians, a lot of powerful rich people. They bombed Matins in 1911 in part of a wide campaign of civil disobedience across London. So there were multiple demonstrations and attacks on the same night and day, and that damaged this damaged the window that was originally here, and then that, we believe, is why later on this window was commissioned to replace that. So it almost made space for the decorated stained glass window that we see here. But yeah, a very rare example of a monument in St George's. As we were talking about earlier, there aren't very many others.
No, there aren't, but it's a very austere place. I'm tempted to use the word bankerly, which sounds a bit unfair, but
I think it's understated and it's quite clean.
Yes.
And I think part of that, I think that's what makes the reredos so effective as well, because it really makes it stand out. Yes. And it really draws the attention then to that depiction of the Last Supper in a way that if you go into more decorated churches, it's such a bombardment of the senses that it is almost overwhelming, whereas here everything is drawn very much to the East End, to the glass during the day and to the painting. Parish churches often are kind of the reservoir for the history of their local area, of all sorts of history as well. So everything from kind of like the domestic servants we were talking about earlier, all the way through to military history, high-flying political figures. You find it all at St George's.